Often we read the Gospel of John on Easter Sunday day, but we can also use the Gospel from the evening before at the Vigil, and this year it's the Gospel of Mark, which I just read. I chose it because it's, well, very simple, very direct, like all of Mark, the simplest and most original Gospel in terms of time. Because it is a great mystery. And we tend to, well, if we focus on it at all, we focus on, oh, this is a great mystery for Jesus. It's been pointed out in Western iconography, Jesus is usually alone with some banner, doing like, as has been said, like a touchdown dance. I'm raised! Wow! Whereas on the East, if you look at the icons of the resurrection, he's raising Adam and Eve up from the netherworld. In other words, we come up with it. And that's the center, most important point in a sense, of the mystery. You have to realize that we are raised up. It's not just some resurrection at the end of the world. It's now. And we should be experiencing that and feeling that, living that. It says, the second reading from Colossians says that we've already died with him, but that's not all. We're already raised with him. Paul says to the Ephesians, he has given us life with him. He makes up his own words. He's given us life with him. He has raised us up with him and has already seated us with him in the heavenly places. I always like to ask, how's that feeling for you? I mean, are you aware of sitting with Christ already in the heavenly places? In other words, our whole being should be expanded. And we should be able, by that, to recognize Christ not only in the heavenly places, but everywhere. To see with the eyes of Christ, and if we see with the eyes of Christ, what we'll see is Christ. In a sense, Jesus made that easier for us by his appearances after the resurrection that we read all during the Gospels this coming week, during the octave. Just think, he rose from the dead, victorious over death, king of the whole universe, and what does he do? Does he appear on a big cloud in front of everybody and say, I'm raised and I'm the king, worship me? No. That's not what God would do. God is not like us, pushing ourselves forward and making a big fuss and wanting to be made a fuss of. That's not how God works. So what did Jesus do after his resurrection? He appeared as a gardener. Mary Magdalene thought he was the gardener. That's how unobtrusive he was. Just one of us. Or he appeared on the banks of the lake when the disciples had been fishing all night. They didn't even recognize him at first. John recognized him. Oh, that's Jesus. Children, have you caught anything? Go ahead, cast your net. When they came ashore, what did he do? He made them breakfast. Someone who makes you breakfast is Christ. Or someone you make breakfast for. You. So, likewise, the disciples on the road to Emmaus, remember that? They were discussing all the events, and they didn't even recognize, once again, as like we never do, we never recognize, Jesus walking right with them. Whoever's walking with you, wherever you are, is Christ. As you are. So the companions on the journey, they're Christ. And we're asked to be able to recognize Christ everywhere. Because he is everywhere. We don't give enough attention to these texts, like the one from Colossians, which says, Christ is all in all. If Christ is all in all, then where can you look that he's not? It also says in Ephesians, the body of him who fills all in all. Translated sometimes, who fills the universe in all its parts. So wherever the Hubble telescope or whichever the new telescope looks, it's Christ. So we need to be able to learn to calm down and look. and quiet our inner noise so we can, first of all, hear his inspirations, but above all, see him. Carol Hauslander, who was a Catholic from the 20th century, wrote in her autobiography, and this is quoted at the beginning of Father Richard Rohr's marvelous book, The Universal Christ, which I heartily recommend as Easter reading. It says, I was in the underground train, in the subway, she was. It's in London, and a crowded train in which all sorts of people jostled together, sitting and strap hanging. And quite suddenly, she says, I saw in my mind, but as vividly as a wonderful picture, Christ in them all. But I saw more than that. And not only was Christ in every one of them, living in them, and dying in them, and rejoicing in them, and sorrowing in them, but because it was him, and because they were there, because he was in them, and because they were there, the whole world was there too. Here in them, that one underground train. And by the way, she goes on to add, but if the world as it was at that moment, but not only the world as it was at that moment, not only all the people in all the countries of the world, not only those who had died in the past, but all those yet to come. So not only is place overcome, but time is overcome. Christ is all in all, of all times and all places. That's what we need to be able to see. With the very heart and the eyes of Christ, which alone can recognize Christ himself in everyone and everything. But we have to open ourselves to that level of depth. And it can be a very, very, very beautiful thing, as you just heard. Thomas Merton, our own Thomas Merton, this is his Church of Baptism, as you know, writes this about how we can really recognize, have a vision of things if we're really quiet. He says, when we are alone on a starlit night, when by chance we see the migrating birds in autumn descending on a grove of junipers to rest and eat, when we see children in a moment when they are really children, when we know love in our own hearts, or when, like the Japanese poet Basho, we hear an old frog land in a quiet pond with a solitary splash. At such times, the awakening, the turning inside out of all values, the newness, the emptiness, and the purity of vision that make themselves evident, all these provide a glimpse of the cosmic dance, as he calls it. And it is a cosmic dance with Christ. It's what life is. Christ's cosmic dance. That's what we should be doing with Christ. The Hindus knew it was a cosmic dance. We should too. And we'd be able to recognize Christ doing the dance, Christ as the dance, and we as the dancers and the dance at the same time. And the dance isn't always, a jig. It's sometimes, a dirge. Isn't that what Carol just said? Christ was in them, living in them, dying in them, rejoicing in them, and sorrowing in them. But it's all Christ. It all leads to life. And our hearts have to be open enough to, well, as the second Beatitude says, blessed are those who mourn. I had my own experience of that yesterday. On the underground, no less. We call it the subway. And the subway, as you know, is getting to be a potentially pretty violent place. Well, I experienced that. Going south on the one train just before we got to 96th Street. Suddenly in my own car, there was a huge uproar. And this man stood up and started ranting and raving and shouting and pushing. He pushed a whole row of bench seaters, he was seated, off within a second. and continued to rant, "Stop touching me! Stop disrespecting me!" Now, who knows what was happening? Maybe the touching was inappropriate, or maybe it was just incidental. It was a crowded subway. They were sitting right next to each other. Who knows? And the one who was being accused, looked puzzled and terrified. But the man kept shouting and shouting. When we got to the station, they had to empty the train and call the police. And I was still in the car, he kept walking back and forth and up and down saying, "So much disrespect! Stop touching me! So much disrespect!" It was a black man. And I don't say that out of racism. Because who else in this country, apart from the Native Americans, has been so much disrespected, manhandled, oppressed, frustrated than the blacks? Who knows what was going on in that man's life that at that particular point he had to blow up? Now, was his conduct acceptable? Well, no, but it was understandable. So where do we stand on that? We can sympathize with everybody in the car and see Christ in them and the one who was assaulted. And which was the assaulter and which was the assaulted? Yeah, maybe both. But that's not the point. The point is Christ is in both of them. If we can't recognize the suffering Christ in someone who is so suffering that he behaves in that way, we don't yet have the heart or the eyes of the risen Christ, who is everywhere and in everyone and in everything. So yes, let us rejoice when we can recognize him in children being children, in a beautiful sunrise, in the silent moments when someone's making us breakfast or we're making someone breakfast. But if we don't recognize them also in the suffering of the violent or those who are suffering from violence, then we haven't recognized him yet. Because he is all in all. You can't chase him away. You can't. He's always there. And we need to be always there too.